The Wyoming sun, thin and pale as watered milk, slanted through the tall, unadorned glass of the Redemption Community Church. It lit up the dust motes dancing in the air, turning them into a swirling galaxy of tiny, golden specks. They settled on the rough-hewn pine pews, on the worn Bible resting on the pulpit, and on the stiff shoulders of Jonas Kincaid as he stood before Reverend Miller. It was 10:30. The wedding was meant to start at 10. Jonas Kincaid was not a man accustomed to waiting. He was a man of property, of fences and cattle brandings and contracts signed with a decisive flick of the wrist. His face, usually weathered into a mask of confident authority, was beginning to show cracks. He pulled a silver watch from his waistcoat pocket, the chain glinting in the weak light. He snapped it open, stared at the porcelain face, and shut it with a click that sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil in the heavy silence. There were perhaps 20 people scattered amongst the pews. The ranchers and their wives, the blacksmith, the general store owner. They had come out of a sense of duty, and now they sat in a state of shared, uncomfortable curiosity. Whispers rustled through the small congregation like dry leaves skittering across a hard-packed yard. Never took Clara May for the timid type. Martha Gable, the blacksmith's wife, murmured behind her gloved hand to her husband. But a wedding day can spook the calmest filly. Her husband just grunted, his eyes fixed on Jonas. He'd seen the way Kincaid handled his horses, efficient, but with no softness. He wondered if the girl had finally seen it, too. Reverend Miller, a man whose gentle spirit was ill-suited for such tension, cleared his throat. Jonas, perhaps Mrs. Miller should go over to the boarding house, see if Miss Whitaker is feeling unwell. Jonas's jaw tightened. Unwell. It was an excuse. A polite fiction for what he was beginning to suspect was an act of outright defiance, a public humiliation. Do it, he clipped out, his voice low and hard. He turned his back to the pews, staring at the plain wooden cross on the wall as if he could will it to give him answers. He had made a good offer for Clara May Whitaker. Her father, a man with more debts than sense, had been eager to accept. Jonas was to get a pretty wife, one with hands skilled at sewing and a quiet disposition. She was to get the security of his name, his ranch, his standing. It was a fair trade, a solid piece of business. He had not factored in the possibility of her having an opinion on the matter. Mrs. Miller, a small, bird-like woman, scurried out of the church, her footsteps echoing on the wooden porch before being swallowed by the dirt street. The minutes stretched out, each one longer and heavier than the last. The sun climbed higher. The light in the church grew stronger, illuminating the emptiness of the space where a bride was supposed to stand. When Mrs. Miller returned, she was breathless and pale. She didn't walk to the altar. She stopped halfway down the aisle, her hands twisting the fabric of her dress. All eyes turned to her. "She's not there. Reverend," she said, her voice a reedy whisper that carried through the entire church. "Her room is empty. The bed hasn't been slept in. Her travel bag is gone." She held up a small, delicate object. This was on the floor, by the chair. It was a handkerchief, fine linen, with a border of handmade lace, the pattern a delicate string of forget-me-nots. Clara's work. Everyone recognized her stitching. It was the only thing she had left behind. Not a note, not a word of explanation. Just a small, silent square of white, a testament to a promise made and then, in the dark of night, irrevocably broken. Jonas Kincaid turned slowly from the altar. His face was a thundercloud. He didn't look at the handkerchief. He looked past the frightened faces of the townspeople, through the open church doors, and out at the vast, empty plains that stretched to the horizon. She had run. The quiet, compliant girl had found a spine and used it to run from him. The humiliation was a hot poker in his gut. "Find her," he said, his voice no longer a clip, but a low growl of command directed at the town sheriff, who was already rising slowly from his pew. "I want her found." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The moon had been a sliver of bone against a black velvet sky when Clara May Whitaker had ridden out of town. She rode not on a delicate lady's mare, but on Bess, the sturdy, long-suffering mustang she had raised from a foal. Her gait a steady, ground-eating rhythm. The wind was cold, a harbinger of the winter to come, and it tore at the stray strands of hair that had escaped from her simple braid, whipping them across her face like tiny lashes. She didn't look back. Looking back was a luxury she couldn't afford. Behind her was the tidy room at the boarding house, the scent of lavender and lye soap, and the suffocating weight of Jonas Kincaid's expectations. Behind her was a life laid out for her like a burial shroud, predictable, orderly, and utterly devoid of air. Her only possessions were in a single, worn leather saddlebag tied behind her cantle, a change of clothes, a small tin of biscuits, a water skin, and the tools of her trade needles, thread, and a pair of sharp shears, tucked away at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was the dress, her wedding dress. It wasn't finished. She had been working on it for months, stitching it by the faint light of a kerosene lamp long after the rest of the town was asleep. It was made of simple, cream-colored cotton, not silk or satin, but she had poured all her quiet dreams into its seams. The bodice was meant to have a row of tiny, mother-of-pearl buttons, and the hem was waiting for a final border of the same forget-me-not lace as the handkerchief she had unknowingly dropped in her haste. Now, the dress felt like a stranger's garment. The soft cotton was a reminder of the soft words Jonas had used in the beginning, words that had slowly hardened into commands. The sharp needle she'd used to sew it felt like the sharp, assessing glances he gave her, measuring her worth as he would a head of cattle. The thought of him, of his hand on her arm, his grip just a little too tight, of the way his eyes went flat and cold when she dared to voice a thought of her own, was a spur in her side, pushing her and Bess on through the night. The past wasn't just a shadow, it was a physical presence that rode with her. It was the memory of her father's resigned sigh as he signed the marriage contract, trading her for a cleared debt. It was the echo of the townswomen's voices, congratulating her on her good fortune, their eyes filled with a mixture of envy and pity. "Jonas Kincaid is a fine catch," they'd said. "He'll take good care of you." Their idea of care was a well-built cage, a place where she would be safe, provided for, and utterly silent. Her own thoughts, her own desires, were inconvenient trifles to be packed away like winter clothes. She had tried, for her father's sake, to make peace with it. She had tried to see the kindness in Jonas's gifts, the security in his possessiveness, but with every passing day, the bars of the cage had grown closer, and she had felt her own spirit, the small, flickering flame of who she was, beginning to suffocate. The night before the wedding had been the breaking point. He had come to the boarding house, bringing her a gift, a heavy silver locket, as he fastened it around her neck, his fingers cold against her skin. He had leaned in close. "Tomorrow, you will be Mrs. Kincaid," he'd whispered, his breath smelling of whiskey and self-satisfaction. "You will belong to me." Belong? The word had echoed in the hollow space inside her. Not be with me. Not share a life with me. Belong. Like a horse, a parcel of land, a silver locket. In that moment, the fear of the unknown, of the vast, dangerous wilderness, had become smaller than the fear of the known, of the quiet, respectable life that awaited her. So she had run. She had waited until the town was dark and silent, then slipped out to the livery, saddled Bess, and ridden west, toward the jagged teeth of the mountains that bit into the edge of the sky, toward nothing she could name and everything she hoped for, as the first hint of dawn bled across the eastern plains, turning the black sky to a bruised purple and then a dusty rose. Clara pulled Bess to a halt in a small copse of aspen trees. Both of them were bone-weary, their breath pluming in the frigid air. She slid from the saddle, her limbs stiff and aching. Her first thought was for the horse. She loosened the cinch and let Bess drink from a small, clear stream that trickled between the rocks. Only then did she allow herself to rest, slumping against a tree trunk and pulling a biscuit from her bag. It was dry and hard, but it was food. She looked at her hands, raw and chapped from the rains. They were her own. She looked out at the endless expanse of sagebrush and sky. It was terrifying, but it was hers to face. She didn't know where she was going, but for the first time in a long time, she knew she was the one holding the reins. And that was enough. For now. 3 days of riding had scoured Clara May clean of everything but the essential. The fine lady from Wyoming was gone, sandblasted away by the ceaseless wind that swept across the high plains. In her place was a creature of grit and endurance. Her face was chapped, her lips were cracked, and a fine layer of alkali dust had settled into the lines of her worn dress and the creases around her eyes. Bess, her faithful Mustang, was just as weary, her head hanging low, her gait a shuffling plod. They were running on the last dregs of determination. They found Dry Hollow by following a creek bed that had promised water and delivered only a ribbon of damp sand. The town wasn't much more than a rumor made real. A handful of weathered, sun-bleached buildings clinging to a hillside as if they feared a strong gust might send them tumbling into the valley below. It was set well back from any main trail, a place you didn't pass through on your way to somewhere else. Dry Hollow was a destination for those who had run out of road. A single main street, wide enough for a wagon to turn if the driver was careful, was flanked by a general store with a sagging porch, a saloon whose bat-wing doors hung slightly askew, and a smithy that looked to be the most prosperous establishment of the lot. A livery, a small sheriff's office with a faded "wanted" poster curling on the wall, and a few scattered houses made up the rest of the town. There was a sense of permanence to the place, but it was the permanence of a rock. Not a tree, it was enduring, not growing. Clara slid off Bess in front of the general store, her legs trembling from exhaustion. She tied the reins to the hitching post, giving the mare a reassuring pat on the neck. "Just a little longer, girl," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. Inside, the store smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and dust. An old man with a fringe of white hair and spectacles perched on the end of his nose looked up from a ledger. "Help you, miss?" he asked, his voice neutral. Clara's hand went instinctively to the small coin purse tucked in her dress pocket. There wasn't much left. "I need oats for my horse, and I was wondering if there was any work to be had hereabouts." The storekeeper, a man who had likely seen a dozen drifters and dreamers pass through his doors, looked her over. He saw the quality of her dress, though it was travel-stained, and the weariness in her eyes that went deeper than the road. He also saw the steady set of her jaw. "Not much work for a woman in Dry Hollow," he said, not unkindly. "Mrs. Abernathy at the saloon is always looking for help, but—" He let the sentence hang, his meaning clear. Clara's chin lifted a fraction. "I'm looking for honest labor, mending, cooking, cleaning, ranch work, if need be." The man considered this. "Well," he said slowly, rubbing a thumb across his jaw. "Heard Calder Brooks was looking for a hand to see him through the winter. Lost his summer help to a broken leg, but it's hard work out at the Black Spur, fencing, chopping wood, tending stock in the snows. It's no work for—" He stopped himself again. He wasn't one to tell a person what they could or couldn't do. "Where is this Black Spur ranch?" Clara asked, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. He gave her the directions 2 miles north. "Follow the creek until you see a rock formation that looks like a spur and measured out a bag of oats." Clara paid him, her small supply of coins dwindling to almost nothing. As she left, she felt his eyes on her back, curious but not unkind. In a town this small, a stranger was an event. A woman, stranger, alone, was a mystery. The ride to the Black Spur felt longer than 2 miles. The ranch was tucked into a shallow canyon, protected from the worst of the winds. It was a place built for function, not for show. The house was a sturdy log cabin, low-roofed and solid, with a stone chimney breathing a thin plume of smoke into the crisp air. A large barn, a series of corrals, and several smaller outbuildings stood nearby, all of them showing signs of constant repair and maintenance. The fences were taut, the gates hung straight. It was the home of a man who took care of his things. A man was in one of the corrals, working with a young, skittish colt on a long rope. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that seemed to calm the animal. He was tall, taller than Jonas, with broad shoulders that filled out his worn canvas shirt. Even from a distance, Clara could see he was a man shaped by hard work and open spaces. This had to be Calder Brooks. She dismounted at the main gate, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. If he turned her away, she had nowhere else to go. She took a breath, pushed the gate open, and led Bess inside, her boots sinking into the soft dirt of the yard. The man in the corral stopped what he was doing. He didn't turn immediately. He finished a slow, patient circle with the colt, murmuring something too low for Clara to hear, before giving the rope a gentle pat and turning to face her. He walked toward her, his stride long and unhurried. As he drew closer, she could see his face. It was weathered by sun and wind, with the lines etched around his eyes and mouth. His hair was dark, his jaw was square, and his eyes were a clear, steady gray, the color of a winter sky. They were eyes that looked at things and saw them for what they were. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze taking in her dusty clothes, her tired horse, and the desperation she was trying so hard to hide. "Can I help you?" he asked. His voice was deep and quiet, a low rumble that seemed to fit the landscape. It held no welcome, but no warning either. It was simply a question. I was told you were looking for a hand for the winter," Clara said, her own voice sounding thin and foreign in the quiet yard. Calder Brooks didn't answer right away. He just looked at her. It wasn't the assessing stare of Jonas Kincaid, which had always made her feel like a piece of livestock being valued. This was a different kind of looking. It was a quiet, thorough inventory. He wasn't judging her, he was simply seeing her. He saw the blister on her palm where the rains had rubbed it raw. He saw the exhaustion that shadowed her eyes. He saw the way she stood straight, despite her weariness, as if daring the world to knock her down. "The work is hard," he said finally. "I'm not afraid of hard work," she replied, meeting his gaze. His eyes flickered down for a fraction of a second, to her left wrist, during her frantic escape, scrambling down a rocky embankment in the dark. She had caught her arm on a thorny branch. A long, thin scratch, now scabbed over, ran from her wrist to the base of her thumb. It was a small, telling mark, a sign of flight, of haste, of trouble left behind. It was a question hanging in the air. A man like Jonas would have pointed to it. Asterisk. "What's that? How did you get that? What kind of trouble are you in?" Asterisk. He would have used it as leverage, a weakness to exploit. Calder Brooks's gray eyes noted the scratch, and then lifted back to her face. He said nothing about it. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she came from, or why a woman who looked like she belonged in a church parlor was standing in his yard asking for a job that would break most men. He simply accepted her presence as a fact, like a sudden shift in the wind or an early frost. The unspoken questions died in the space between them, starved for lack of interest. In his silence, he gave her a gift more precious than food or shelter. He gave her a place to be, without demanding to know the place she had been. For Clara, who had spent a lifetime being questioned, judged, and defined by others, this quiet lack of curiosity was a balm. It was a space to breathe. He turned his head and looked at the big barn. The stalls need mucking. The woodpile needs to be stacked before the first snow. The tack in the shed needs mending. He wasn't testing her. He was stating facts. This was the work. He looked back at her. "You can bunk in the hayloft. Board and 10 a month. You can start now." It wasn't an offer made with warmth. but it was made with a straightforward fairness that was more comforting than any false smile. Relief washed over Clara so powerfully her knees felt weak. She had done it. She had found a foothold. She could only nod, not trusting her voice. "There's a pump by the house," he said, gesturing with his chin. "Your horse can drink there. Then you can put her in the end stall." He turned then, without another word, and walked back to the colt in the corral, picking up the long rope as if she were already a part of the landscape, a hand hired to do a job, nothing more and nothing less. Clara stood for a long moment, watching him. She looked down at her own scratched wrist, and then at the vast, quiet ranch around her. For the first time since she'd ridden out of Wyoming, she didn't feel like she was running from something. She felt like she might have finally arrived. The hayloft at the Black Spur Ranch became Clara's entire world. It was a space that smelled of sweet, dry alfalfa and old leather, a scent that worked its way into her clothes and hair, erasing the last traces of lavender soap from the boarding house in Wyoming. Her bed was a thick pile of clean straw in a corner, covered with her own spare blanket and a heavy wool one Calder had left for her on the loft floor the first evening without a word. Through a gap in the barn boards, she could see a sliver of the night sky, and the stars were brighter here, colder and sharper than any she had ever known. Her days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the ranch. She rose before dawn, the air in the loft so cold it stung her lungs. She would break the thin layer of ice in the wash basin to splash her face, the shock of it a brutal but effective alarm. Then she would climb down the ladder into the hushed darkness of the barn, where the warm, animal breath of the horses misted in the lantern light. The work was relentless, a constant ache in muscles she hadn't known she possessed. She learned to swing a pitchfork, her movements clumsy at first, then more fluid as she mucked out the stalls. She stacked firewood until her hands were raw with splinters, the rhythmic thud of the logs a steady beat to her day. Calder had a pile of mending canvas jackets with ripped seams, thick wool shirts with worn elbows. She took to it in the evenings, her needle moving with a practiced skill that was a ghostly reminder of another life, of stitching lace for a wedding dress she would never wear. Here, her stitches were for survival, for reinforcing a torn pocket or patching a fraying cuff. The work was honest and straightforward. It asked nothing of her but her effort, and she gave it willingly. Mornings were the quietest time between them. The first week. She had watched him from a distance as he built a small fire outside the cabin and boiled coffee in a battered tin pot. On the 8th morning, as she came out of the barn, he gestured with his head toward a second tin cup sitting on a stump near the fire. It was not an invitation spoken aloud, but a simple fact. There was a cup. She could take it or leave it. She took it. He poured the coffee without a word. It was black, strong enough to dissolve a horseshoe, and scalding hot. She learned how he made it by watching a handful of grounds thrown into boiling water, brought to a froth 3 times before being settled with a splash of cold water. He never instructed her, but one morning when he was already in the far pasture checking a fence line, she made it for him. When he came back, he picked up the cup she'd left for him, took a sip, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. In the silent world of Calder Brooks, that nod was a paragraph of praise. As the weeks turned into a month, Clara's presence on the Black Spur Ranch settled from a curiosity into a simple fact. The same was not true for the town of Dry Hollow. When she rode into town for supplies, flour, salt, coffee beans, a stillness followed her down the main street. She felt the weight of eyes on her back. From the shadowed doorway of the saloon, from behind the lace curtains of the few respectable houses, from the dusty window of the sheriff's office, the town watched her. They saw a woman who carried herself with a quiet dignity that seemed at odds with her circumstance. Her hands, though calloused and often nicked, were slender. The dress she wore was plain and patched, but it had once been a garment of quality, and despite the hard labor, a fineness to her features remained the high cheekbones, the steady, dark eyes, the way her hair, pulled back in a simple braid, caught the light. She was beautiful, and her beauty made her presence in this hard, forgotten place all the more jarring. They saw her lift a 50-pound sack of flour onto Bess's back without assistance. They saw her speak to the storekeeper, Mr. Gable, her voice low and polite, her requests clear and concise. They saw that she never lingered, never engaged in gossip, never complained. She did her business and she left. This quiet, self-contained woman doing a man's work for the most reclusive man in the county was a puzzle they couldn't solve. And so they talked. Clara heard the whispers. She had learned to be observant, to listen to the spaces between words. One afternoon, while waiting for Mr. Gable to weigh out some beans, she stood near the back of the store, by the barrels of pickles and crackers. Two women, their heads bowed together over a bolt of calico fabric, were talking. It was Martha Gable, the blacksmith's wife, and another woman whose name Clara didn't know. "It just ain't natural," the unknown woman was saying, her voice a low hum. "A woman like that, living out there in a barn, and with him, he hasn't had a soul on that place, besides hired men, in, what has it been? Martha, 6 years. Nearer 7 now, Mrs., Gable replied, her voice filled with a sad, knowing tone. "Not since the fire, not since Elspeth." Clara froze, her hand hovering over a sack of sugar. "Poor Elspeth," the first woman sighed. "She was such a bright little thing, always laughing. You'd hear her singing clear across the valley some mornings. She was half his size but twice his voice. They were so happy, building that place up from nothing." "Mrs." Gable's voice dropped even lower, becoming a murmur of remembered tragedy. "The fire came up the canyon so fast, a dry thunderstorm, the sheriff said. Started with a lightning strike 10 miles south. By the time anyone saw the smoke, it was a monster. Calder was out in the north pasture with the horses. He saw it coming. A wall of flame. He managed to drive the herd into the creek bed and save the barn. But the old cabin, it went up like a tinderbox." A heavy silence fell between the two women. Clara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She could picture it, the smoke, the roar of the flames, the terror. He tried to get back to her. "Mrs." Gable continued, her voice thick with emotion. "He ran right into that fire. The men who found him said his clothes were smoldering, his hands burned raw. But he was too late. There was nothing left. He buried what he could find under that big oak tree behind the new house he built. And it burned the words right out of him," the other woman added. "He spoke some before. Not much, but some. After Elspeth, it was like the fire took his voice, too. Took everything but the work. No one's gotten close to him since. His heart is a closed and bolted door." Clara paid for her supplies, her mind a world away. Her hands were trembling slightly as she accepted the change from Mr. Gable. He looked at her with a new expression in his eyes, a flicker of something like pity, and she knew that he knew she had overheard. The ride back to the Black Spur was different. The landscape, which had once seemed merely vast and lonely, now felt haunted by a ghost of laughter and song. She looked at the sturdy cabin Calder had built, its logs perfectly notched, its roofline straight and true. It wasn't just a house. It was a fortress built atop ashes. The fences weren't just to keep cattle in. They were lines drawn against a world that could take everything in a heartbeat. When she saw Calder by the corral, sharpening an axe on a whetstone, she saw a different man. His silence was no longer a mystery, but a scar. His solitude was not a choice, but a consequence. His quiet, steady gaze held not just the emptiness of the plains, but the memory of a world turned to smoke. She understood now why he asked no questions. A man who has lost everything has no interest in the small troubles of others. She unloaded her supplies, her movements slow and deliberate. She thought of the unspoken kindness he had shown her, the cup of coffee, the extra blanket, the way he left her to her work without interference. They were the gestures of a man who knew that, sometimes. The only comfort you could offer another soul was a quiet space to heal. That evening, as she sat in the hayloft mending one of his shirts, she looked out the gap in the boards toward the solitary light burning in the cabin window. She was a woman who had run from a future that felt like a cage. He was a man who was living in the ruins of his past, and between them, in the vast, cold silence of the Wyoming high country, a fragile, unspoken understanding began to take root. The first snow of the season came without warning. One afternoon, the pale autumn sun dissolved into a sky the color of slate, and the wind, which had been a constant, nagging presence, fell into an eerie hush. Then, the first flakes began to drift down, not in a flurry, but as individual, hesitant messengers of the winter to come. By nightfall, the world outside the barn had been transformed into a maelstrom of swirling white. Clara sat in the hayloft, huddled under both of her blankets. A thick horse blanket draped over her shoulders for extra warmth. She had finished her work for the day, rubbing down the horses until their coats shone even in the dim lantern light, and ensuring their water troughs weren't frozen. Now, the wind howled around the corners of the barn, a low, mournful sound that seemed to seep through the very boards. Each gust shook the old structure, and fine powder snow sifted through the cracks, dusting the hay around her like confectioner's sugar. She had eaten her last 2 biscuits for supper, chewing them slowly to make them last. The cold was a living thing, a predator that gnawed at her fingers and toes and settled deep into her bones. Shivering, she drew her knees to her chest, trying to make herself a smaller target. She thought of the cabin, of the plume of smoke she'd seen rising from its chimney earlier. A fire. Warmth. It felt as distant and unattainable as the moon. She would not ask for more than what was offered. The hayloft was her place. She would endure it. But the cold was relentless, and it began to dredge up memories she fought to keep buried. The memory of a different kind of coldness, the chill in Jonas Kincaid's eyes, the icy resolve in his voice. The loneliness of the loft felt vast, but it was a clean loneliness. The loneliness she'd felt in Wyoming had been suffocating, the feeling of being utterly alone while in a room full of people. Still, the fear remained, fear of the winter, of her own weakness, and of the day her meager savings ran out. A single, hot tear escaped and froze on her cheek, a tiny dagger of ice. She brushed it away angrily. She had not come this far to weep in a snowstorm. Suddenly, a sound cut through the howl of the wind, a heavy rhythmic crunching in the snow. Her body went rigid. Her first thought was of Jonas. Had he found her? Had he tracked her to this remote, forgotten place? She held her breath, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The footsteps stopped directly below the loft's main opening. "Miss!" a low voice called out. Calder's voice. Relief washed over her, so potent it left her dizzy. She scrambled to the edge of the loft, peering down. He stood in the wide-open doorway of the barn, a lantern in one hand, casting a pool of golden light onto the freshly fallen snow. He was a dark, solid shape against the swirling white chaos behind him, his shoulders and the brim of his hat already covered in a thick layer. "Come down," he said. It wasn't a request. It was a simple command, devoid of emotion, like his statements about the work that needed doing. Her fingers were numb and clumsy as she navigated the ladder. When she reached the barn floor, she stood before him, shivering, the horse blanket clutched around her. She was acutely aware of what a pathetic sight she must be, her nose red, her face pale with cold, her body trembling uncontrollably. She braced herself for what he might say. Perhaps he'd decided the work was too much for her, that he was sending her away, even into this storm. He didn't say any of that. He simply looked at her for a moment, his gray eyes taking in her shivering form. "The storm's getting worse," he stated, as if commenting on the weather was all the explanation needed. He turned and started walking toward the cabin. "Come on." Clara hesitated for only a second before following. To refuse would be foolish, an act of pride she could not afford. She trudged behind him, her boots sinking deep into the snow, her head bowed against the stinging wind. The short walk to the cabin felt like crossing a frozen continent. He pushed the door open and stepped aside to let her enter. The sudden wave of warmth that enveloped her was so intense it made her gasp. A large fire roared in the stone hearth, its flames leaping and dancing, casting a warm, flickering light across the single, large room. The air smelled of wood smoke, pine, and something else, the rich, savory scent of simmering stew. It was a man's home, stark and functional. A sturdy table and 2 chairs sat in the center of the room. A bed, neatly made with a dark wool blanket, was pushed against one wall. A simple shelf held a few books and a handful of tin plates. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor, no paintings on the walls. There was nothing of Elspeth here, nothing of a woman's touch. It was a space stripped down to its barest essentials, a place for shelter and sleep, not for living. And yet, tonight, with the fire blazing and the smell of food in the air, it felt like the most welcoming place on earth. Clara drifted toward the hearth as if pulled by an invisible string. She held her numb hands out to the flames, the feeling returning to them in a rush of painful pins and needles. The shivering began to subside, but a deeper trembling took its place, a tremor born of exhaustion, relief, and a profound, aching gratitude. The unshed tears from the loft rose again, blurring the dancing flames. She fought them back, her throat tight. Calder moved about the room with his usual quiet economy of motion. He shut the door against the storm. The sound of the wind instantly muted to a distant moan. He took a stoneware bowl from the shelf, ladled it full of thick, steaming stew from a pot hanging over the fire, and broke off a chunk of dark bread from a loaf on the table. He came and stood beside her, holding out the bowl. She turned to take it, and in the firelight, he could not miss the sheen of tears in her eyes or the way her chin trembled as she fought for control. He saw the red-rimmed exhaustion, the deep, bruised look of a soul that had been stretched to its breaking point. Clara braced herself for the question. Asterisk. What is it? What's wrong, asterisk? It was what anyone would ask. It was the opening that would require her to speak of Jonas, of her flight, of the fears that haunted her in the dark. Her story felt like a lead weight in her chest, a burden too heavy to speak aloud. But Calder did not ask. His gaze was steady, but it wasn't prying. He looked at her face, and then he looked away, toward the fire, affording her a moment of privacy. You don't have to talk, he said, his voice a low rumble, softer than she'd ever heard it. Just eat. He pressed the warm bowl into her hands and then moved away, taking his own plate to the far side of the hearth, creating a comfortable distance between them. He sat on the stone ledge, his back partially to her, and began to eat, leaving her alone with the fire and his unexpected kindness. The words, asterisk, just eat, asterisk echoed in her head. Such simple words, yet they held a universe of meaning. It was a kindness without condition, a charity without a price. Jonas's every gift had been a transaction, a down payment on the obedience he expected in return. The townspeople's politeness was a currency they exchanged for gossip. But this was different. This was a man who had looked at her pain and had not demanded an explanation for it. He had simply offered a remedy, a warm fire, a hot meal. Clara sank onto a low stool by the hearth, the rough wool of the horse blanket still around her shoulders. She lifted the spoon to her lips, her hand still shaking slightly. The stew was rich with beef and root vegetables, and it was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. It was more than food. It was warmth. It was life. It was a moment of peace in the heart of a storm, both outside and within. She ate slowly, savoring each spoonful, the heat of it spreading through her body, chasing away the last of the cold. She didn't look at him, and he didn't look at her. They sat in a shared, comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire, the moan of the wind outside, and the quiet scrape of spoons against stoneware. For the first time in her life, Clara felt that her silence was not being judged as weakness or insolence. It was simply being respected. In the quiet cabin of this stranger who had lost everything, she felt, for the first time since she'd fled, completely and utterly safe. After the first snow, things settled into a new, unspoken arrangement. The hayloft, with its drafty walls and the fine, sifting snow that found its way through every crack, was no longer a suitable shelter. The night of the storm, after they had finished their stew in silence, Calder had risen and added another log to the fire. He'd gestured toward a simple cot in the far corner of the cabin, a space that had previously been used for storing sacks of beans and extra blankets. "You can sleep there," he'd said. "It's warmer." And that was that. Clara moved her meager possessions from the barn to the corner of the cabin. A curtain of privacy was drawn, not by a physical object, but by the sheer force of Calder's deliberate lack of attention. He gave her that corner of the room as if it were a separate territory, never letting his gaze linger there, affording her a sense of solitude even in the shared space. Their lives became a quiet, intertwined rhythm of work and survival against the deepening cold. Winter took hold of the canyon, burying the world in a thick blanket of white. The work changed. It was no longer about expansion and preparation, but about maintenance and endurance. They worked together from sunup to sundown, a partnership that existed almost entirely without words. A language of gestures and shared understanding grew between them. In the mornings, they would break the thick ice in the horse troughs, their breaths pluming in the frigid air. He would swing the heavy axe, and she would haul the shattered pieces of ice away. He never had to ask. She simply knew what was needed. They spent days in the dim, cold barn, repairing tack. She would sit on a low stool, her fingers, though chapped and sore, moving with an innate grace as she stitched a tear in a leather strap or rewrapped a frayed rope end. He would work nearby, mending a broken buckle with his large, surprisingly dexterous hands, the tap of his small hammer a steady counterpoint to the sigh of the wind outside. He would hold a piece steady for her. She would pass him the tool he needed before he could reach for it. He still called her Miss, or sometimes, just you. "Miss, can you check the gray mare's left foreleg? She's favoring it. You see that fence post by the creek? The snow's weighed it down. We'll need to fix it tomorrow." At first, the anonymity had been a shield. Miss was a title for a ghost, a woman without a past, and that was exactly what she had wanted to be. She was a set of hands, a worker, her history, her name, the life that had belonged to Clara May Whitaker, had been shed somewhere on the high plains between Wyoming and Dry Hollow. To be nameless was to be safe. To be Miss was to be a blank slate, free from the expectations and ownership that had nearly suffocated her. But as the weeks passed, as the rhythm of their shared life became more familiar, the lack of a name began to feel different. It was no longer a shield, but a void. She would watch him talk to his horses, murmuring their names: Orion, Silas, June, with a low, gruff affection. He knew their names, their histories, their temperaments. She, however, remained an outline, a figure defined only by her function. The work gave her purpose, but the lack of a name made her feel transient, as if she might one day evaporate in the cold air, leaving no trace behind. She was there, but she wasn't real asterisk. The moment she chose to speak came on an afternoon of profound stillness. A fresh layer of snow had fallen overnight, and the world was muffled and serene. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the sun on the snow was so bright it hurt the eyes. They were in the barn, conducting the slow, methodical winter count of the horses, ensuring every animal was healthy and accounted for. Calder stood with a ledger, making notes, his deep voice a low rumble as he called out observations. "Orion's put on good weight. June's coat is thick. Silas has a small cut on his flank. Need to check it later." Clara moved among the horses, her touch gentle, her presence calming. The animals, who had been skittish around her at first, had come to accept her as part of their world. She ran a hand down the powerful neck of a big roan, feeling the warmth of its life beneath the thick winter hair. She was a part of this place. She fed these animals, cared for them, knew their individual quirks. She was not a ghost. Calder finished his count and closed the ledger. He leaned against a stall door, his gaze resting on her for a moment. It wasn't an intrusive look. It was quiet, observational. He was watching the way she moved, the competent, gentle way she handled the animals. In his eyes, for a fleeting second, she saw a flicker of something that looked like approval. The silence stretched, comfortable and familiar. It was in this quiet space, a space he had created and maintained for her, that she finally felt safe enough to claim a piece of herself back. She turned from the horse and looked at him, her heart giving a small, nervous flutter. She wasn't the runaway bride from Wyoming anymore. She wasn't just Miss, the hired hand. "Clara," she said. Her voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but in the vast, still silence of the barn, the single word landed with the weight and clarity of a chiming bell. It was not an introduction. It was a statement, an offering, the first piece of her true self that she had willingly given to anyone since she had fled. Calder did not react with surprise. He didn't say, "Pardon," or "What was that?" His gray eyes simply held hers. He didn't smile, nor did his expression change in any discernible way. But he looked at her, truly looked at her, and she felt as if he were seeing her for the first time. He saw the woman, not just the worker. He saw the person who belonged to the name. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. Just once, an acceptance, a confirmation. He didn't repeat the name aloud, didn't ask for a surname, didn't press for any more information than she had offered. He accepted the name as he had accepted the cup of coffee she'd made for him, a simple fact that required no discussion. He then pushed off from the stall door. "I'll get the salve for Silas," he said, and walked out of the barn. For a moment, Clara wondered if she had imagined it, if the moment had meant anything at all. 2 days later, they were securing a loose shutter on the cabin before another storm rolled in. She was on a small ladder, holding the heavy wooden shutter in place, the wind tearing at her skirts. He was below, driving a new nail into the frame. "Hold it steady, Clara," he said. The sound of her name, spoken in his low, calm voice, was a physical shock. It wasn't Miss, it wasn't you, it was her, Clara *. The name traveled through the soles of her feet, up her spine, and settled in her heart like a warm stone. It anchored her. It made the ladder feel steady, the ground solid, the world real. In his mouth, the name was not a claim of ownership, as it had been with Jonas. It was a simple acknowledgement of her existence. From that day on, he called her Clara. Each time he said it, she felt a little more solid, a little less like a phantom. "Clara, the fire needs another log. The snow is deep by the north fence." Clara, the name was a simple, sturdy thing. It was a nail driven into the frame of her new life, holding her in place, and for the first time in a very long time, Clara May Whitaker no longer felt like she was invisible. The Chinook winds arrived in late February, a warm, hungry breath that swept down from the mountains and began to devour the winter. The world of the Black Spur Ranch, which had been a stark study in black and white for months, began to bleed color back into its landscape. The snow, hard-packed and deep, softened into a slushy, granular mess. Patches of muddy, brown earth appeared on the sun-facing slopes, smelling rich and alive. The creek, which had been frozen into a silent, icy scar, began to gurgle and crack, its voice returning. For Clara, the change in season felt like a personal thawing. The hard, frozen knot of fear in her chest had begun to soften. working alongside Calder in the sharp winter air. She had built not just fences and stacks of firewood, but a fragile sense of place. The cabin was no longer just his space. It was a shared shelter. Her cot in the corner, the mending basket beside it, the way she knew exactly how he liked his coffee. These small things were the threads from which a new life was being woven. She had a purpose that was not defined by a marriage contract, and a name that was spoken not as a claim, but as a simple fact of her existence. One morning, as she was scattering feed for the chickens, she found herself humming. The tune was a simple, half-forgotten melody from her childhood, and the sound of it in the quiet morning air startled her. It had been so long since she'd felt a lightness in her spirit that it felt foreign, almost improper. She looked over toward the barn where Calder was replacing a hinge on the heavy door. The rhythmic tap of his hammer a steady heartbeat for the ranch. He didn't look up, but she felt, for the first time, a flicker of something akin to happiness. It was a small, delicate shoot, pushing its way up through frozen ground. The sound that shattered the peace came that afternoon. It was the frantic, pounding rhythm of a horse being ridden too hard and too fast. Calder straightened from the fence post he was setting, his head cocked, his gray eyes narrowed toward the trail that led to town. Clara, who was carrying a bucket of water from the pump, froze, her hand tightening on the handle. That sound was wrong. It wasn't the steady gait of a neighbor or the slow plod of a supply wagon. It was the sound of urgency, of trouble. A boy from town, the blacksmith's son, galloped into the yard on a lathered pony, sliding to a halt in a spray of mud and melting snow. He was breathless, his eyes wide. "Mr. Brooks," he gasped, looking from Calder to Clara and back again. "Mr. Brooks. There's 2 men in town, in the saloon. They're asking for a woman, a runaway from Wyoming. One of 'em's a lawman, a federal marshal. The other fella, he's telling everyone she's his fiancée. Says her name is Clara May Whitaker." The name, her full name, struck her like a physical blow. The world tilted, the colors of the spring thaw turning gray and cold again. The bucket slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the muddy ground with a heavy thud. Water sloshing over her boots. She couldn't feel it. All she could feel was the icy grip of the past, a hand reaching across hundreds of miles to drag her back. It was Jonas. It had to be. Calder didn't look at her. His focus was entirely on the boy. "Thank you, Sam," he said, his voice calm and even. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a coin. "Get yourself a candy at the store, and ride home slow. Your pony's earned it." The boy took the coin, his eyes still darting nervously toward Clara. And then, with a nod, he turned the pony and trotted away. His job done. The silence he left behind was immense. Clara stood rooted to the spot, her gaze fixed on the muddy ground. She could feel Calder's presence beside her, solid and still. She couldn't bring herself to look at him. Shame washed over her, hot and suffocating. She had brought this trouble to his door, this quiet, solitary man who had asked nothing of her, who had offered her a refuge. She had repaid him by leading her demons to his home. "I have to go," she whispered, her voice choked. "I'll pack my things. I never meant for this to happen." "Go where?" Calder asked, his voice still quiet, still maddeningly calm. "Away, anywhere, before they come here." She finally looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "He's with a marshal. Calder, you don't understand. He won't stop." "No," he said. It was a single, flat word, an unbreakable wall. "You're not going anywhere." He turned and walked toward the cabin. "Get inside," he said over his shoulder. An hour later, they came. 2 riders, silhouetted against the pale afternoon sun. One was tall and broad, dressed in a fine wool coat and a new hat, his posture rigid with anger and entitlement. Jonas Kincaid. The other man was leaner, older, with a graying mustache and the cold, weary eyes of a man who had seen too much trouble. A silver star was pinned to his vest. He was the law. Clara watched from the cabin window, her hands twisted in her apron, her breath coming in shallow bursts. Her past and her present were about to collide in the muddy yard of the Black Spur Ranch. Calder didn't wait for them to dismount. He stepped off the porch and walked to the middle of the yard, stopping a good 20 feet from them, his stance planted and solid. He wasn't armed, at least not visibly, but he stood as if he were rooted to the very ground of the canyon. "That's far enough," Calder said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. Jonas Kincaid swung down from his horse, his polished boots sinking into the mud. His face was a mask of cold fury. "Brooks, I am Jonas Kincaid, and I've come for what's mine. I have a legal contract and a sworn complaint. That woman in your cabin is my betrothed. She broke our contract and fled my protection, stealing valuable property in the process." He pointed a gloved finger at the cabin. "Clara, get out here now." Clara flinched as if he had struck her. She backed away from the window, her body trembling. Her gaze fell on her small leather bag by the cot. The silver locket he had given her was still in there, a cold, forgotten weight at the bottom. A piece of evidence, a chain to pull her back. She closed her eyes, her head bowed in defeat. The marshal dismounted more slowly, his movements deliberate. "Sir," he said, his voice dry and official, addressing Calder, "I'm Marshal Abernathy. Mr. Kincaid here has filed a complaint. Breach of contract is a civil matter, but theft is a crime. He claims the woman took a family heirloom. I have a warrant to question her." Calder's eyes remained fixed on Jonas. He ignored the marshal for a moment, his silence a palpable force. Then he turned his head slightly, his gray gaze meeting the lawman's. "She works here," Calder said, the words simple, clear, and unassailable. Jonas let out a short, contemptuous laugh. "Works here, she's a runaway. She's deluded you." Calder paid him no mind, his attention still on Marshal Abernathy. "I hired her in the fall. I pay her a wage every month for her labor. $10 and board. She's a free woman, earning a living, not a piece of property." Inside the cabin, Clara's head snapped up. The words cut through her fear. Asterisk, a free woman, earning a living. He wasn't arguing about love or protection. He was using the language of the world, the language of business and law, to define her not as a possession, but as a person. The marshal's expression flickered. This complicated things. A disgruntled fiancé was one thing. A woman with legitimate employment was another. "The matter of the theft still stands," he said, though his tone had lost some of its edge. "What was stolen?" Calder asked. "A silver locket, a family heirloom worth a considerable sum," Jonas snapped, his patience wearing thin. Calder's eyes finally moved to Jonas, and they were as cold and hard as river stones. "If she has it, I'll buy it from you. Name your price. It'll be payment for the trouble you've caused coming all this way." He was reducing Jonas's claim of love and betrayal to a simple monetary transaction, insulting him with the very language he understood best. Jonas's face flushed a dark red. "This isn't about money, it's about principle. It's about my honor. She will return with me." He took a step forward, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. "I won't be made a fool of." Calder didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply stood there, a bulwark of quiet, unyielding strength. His gaze was flat and deadly. "Touch her," Calder said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that was more menacing than any shout. "And you'll have to go through me first." The marshal put a hand on Jonas's arm. "That's enough, Kincaid." He looked at Calder, a long, measuring look. He saw a man who was not making an idle threat. He saw a man who had drawn a line in the mud, and who would die defending it. A tense, vibrating silence descended on the yard. It was a standoff, the law against the man, the past against the present. And inside the cabin, Clara stood listening, tears streaming down her face. They weren't tears of fear or shame anymore. They were tears of a fierce, stunned, and overwhelming gratitude. No one in her entire life had ever stood for her, until now. The standoff in the yard ended not with a bang, but with a quiet, bitter retreat. Marshal Abernathy, a man who could likely read the signs of a coming storm in both the sky and in the eyes of men, made a decision. He saw the immovable object that was Calder Brooks and the volatile, pride-wounded fury of Jonas Kincaid, and he chose the path that wouldn't end in blood staining the muddy snow. "Kincaid, this is a civil dispute tangled up in a misdemeanor," the marshal said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "We'll take it back to the judge in Cheyenne. If he grants you a writ of retrieval, we'll come back. Until then, my authority here is done." He gave Calder a long, hard look. "I'd advise you to stay on the right side of the law, Mr. Brooks." Calder simply nodded, his gaze never leaving Jonas. Jonas looked as if he'd been slapped. "Done! You can't be serious! That woman is currently under this man's roof and in his employ." Abernathy cut in, his voice sharp. "Until a judge says otherwise, she has a right to be here. Let's go." With a look of pure venom directed at the cabin, Jonas swung himself back into his saddle. He was a man accustomed to getting his way, and this public denial of his power was a wound that would fester. He pulled his horse around violently and galloped out of the yard, the marshal following at a more measured pace. They disappeared down the trail, two dark figures shrinking against the vast landscape, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more complicated than any that had come before. Calder stood in the yard for a long time after they were gone, watching the empty trail as if to ensure they wouldn't double back. The tension slowly drained from his shoulders, but he remained a solitary, watchful guardian. Inside the cabin, Clara sank onto her cot, her body trembling with the aftershocks of the confrontation. The tears had stopped, leaving her feeling hollowed out and strangely calm. She had heard every word. Asterisk. A free woman, earning a living. He had given her a new definition, a new armor against the world. Asterisk, to touch her, you'll have to go through me first. He had stood between her and the past, a shield of flesh and bone, and in that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that she had to leave. Her gratitude was a fierce, painful thing. It was a debt she could never repay, and its weight was crushing. Jonas was not a man to accept defeat. He would go to a judge. He would use his money and his influence, and he would be back. Next time, he might not come with a reasonable marshal. He might come with hired men who wouldn't be deterred by a quiet warning. She had seen Calder's eyes when he faced Jonas. There was a capacity for violence there, a deep, cold stillness that was more frightening than any threat. He would fight for her. He would get hurt for her. He might get killed for her. She had run from Wyoming to save herself. Now, she had to run from the Black Spur to save him. When Calder finally came inside, shutting the door softly behind him, she was already moving. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. Instead, she focused on the small, methodical tasks of her departure. She folded the 2 plain dresses she owned and placed them in her worn leather saddlebag. She gathered her mending kit, the needles and thread that were her only real tools. Her hands moved with a quiet, desperate efficiency. He didn't speak. He walked over to the hearth, stoked the fire, and then sat down at the table. His back to her, he poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot that was always warm on the hob. The familiar, homey sounds the scrape of the pot. The splash of the liquid a stark contrast to the tearing of the fragile life she had built here. Every sound in the cabin was magnified. The soft rustle of fabric, the metallic click as she buckled her saddlebag, the creak of the floorboards as she moved from the cot to the small shelf where she kept her hairbrush. Through it all, he sat at the table, his silence a heavy blanket over the room. He didn't ask her what she was doing. He didn't tell her to stop. He didn't try to reason with her. He simply sat, and his stillness was a far more powerful presence than any argument could have been. Her throat ached with unspoken words. She wanted to thank him, She wanted to tell him that his defense of her was the single kindest act anyone had ever shown her. But the words were trapped behind a wall of grief and necessity. To speak them would be to break. To speak them would make it impossible to leave. So she said nothing. Finally, there was nothing left to pack. Her entire existence on the ranch fit into a single, small bag. She retrieved the horse blanket he had given her on that first cold night, folding it neatly and placing it on the end of the cot. It was his. She would take nothing that wasn't hers. Her hand went to the bottom of her bag, and her fingers brushed against the cold, hard shape of the locket. Jonas's locket. She pulled it out. For a moment, she considered leaving it on the table, a final severing, but that felt wrong. It was the evidence of her past, the proof of Jonas's claim. It was her burden to carry, and her problem to solve. She tucked it deep into her pocket. With the saddlebag in her hand, she walked toward the door. Each step was a monumental effort. Her feet felt as if they were wading through thick, deep mud. When she passed the table, she could feel his presence, the warmth radiating from him, the scent of coffee and wood smoke that clung to his clothes. He did not turn. He did not look at her. He just sat there, a silent, unmoving witness to her flight. Her hand reached the door. The iron latch was cold against her trembling fingers. Outside, the world was waiting, the vast, empty plains, the unknown roads, the endless running, her old life. She had thought she'd escaped it, but it had a longer reach than she knew. She rested her forehead against the rough wood of the door, gathering her strength. This was for him. This was the only way she could repay his kindness, by taking her trouble away from his doorstep. She took a shaky breath, her fingers tightening on the latch. This was it. From behind her, his voice, low and quiet, cut through the silence. "Where will you go?" He still hadn't turned around. The question was soft, with no judgment in it, just a simple inquiry. The question broke her. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. She didn't turn to face him. She couldn't. She kept her eyes fixed on the door, her only escape. She murmured the words to the wood grain, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "What if I run?" It was a confession and a question all in one. Asterisk. What if I run from you, the way I've run from everything else? What if this is all I know how to do? What if I bring you nothing but the trouble I'm trying to outpace? Asterisk. The chair scraped against the floorboards as he stood up. She heard his footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching her from behind. She tensed, expecting him to grab her arm, to stop her, to demand she stay. But he stopped a few feet behind her. She could feel him there, a solid presence at her back. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't plead. A small, sad smile touched his lips, though she couldn't see it. The smile was in his voice, a sound of quiet, patient understanding. "I'll wait," Calder said. The two words were so simple, so absurd, so impossible. They weren't a promise of pursuit. They weren't a vow to chase her down and drag her back. They were a statement of stillness, of constancy. A promise that if she ran, there would still be a place in the world for her to come back to. He wasn't her pursuer or her captor. He was her anchor. "And Clara," she stopped. Her hand, which had been gripping the iron latch so tightly her knuckles were white, slowly relaxed. The strength drained from her legs. All the fight, all the desperate momentum that had carried her across hundreds of miles, simply dissolved in the face of those two words. "I'll wait." She didn't turn around. She couldn't. She simply stood at the door, her hand resting on the cold iron, and let the truth of what he said wash over her. Running was easy. Staying was the hardest thing she had ever done. Staying meant facing the trouble that was coming. It meant trusting another person not to break. She leaned her head against the door and let out a long, shuddering breath. Her escape was over. She had finally stopped at the door. Clara did not turn from the door that night. She simply slid her hand from the iron latch and, after a long, quiet moment, walked back to her cot. She sat down, her packed saddlebag beside her like a silent testament to a journey she had decided not to take. Calder, in turn, moved back to the table and sat. Neither of them spoke. The decision hung in the air, a fragile, unspoken pact made in the warm, firelit cabin. The threat of Jonas Kincaid still loomed, a storm gathering on the horizon. But for the first time, Clara was not facing it alone. She was choosing to weather it here. The next morning, the world felt profoundly different. The air was crisp with the promise of spring, and the light that slanted through the cabin window seemed brighter, sharper. Clara woke early, as she always did. But a new sense of purpose moved her. She was not just a hired hand earning her keep. She was a resident, a woman who had chosen to stay. She found Calder by the fire, already boiling water for coffee. Instead of waiting for him to pour, she moved to the small counter where she kept the food supplies. She took out flour, salt, and baking powder. Without a word, she began to make biscuits, her hands moving with a practiced, comforting rhythm. It was a simple, domestic act, but in the context of their silent, functional coexistence, it was a significant shift. She wasn't just taking what was offered. She was contributing, creating something for their shared table. He watched her for a moment, his gaze unreadable, before turning his attention back to the coffee. When the biscuits were baked, golden and fluffy in a small skillet set by the fire, she set them on the table. He poured 2 cups of coffee. They sat down together, not on opposite sides of the hearth as they had on that first snowy night, but at the small table, like any 2 people sharing a morning meal. He took a biscuit, broke it open, and watched the steam rise. He took a bite, then another, and a quiet look of appreciation passed over his face. "My mother used to make biscuits like these," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was the first time he had ever volunteered a piece of his past, however small. Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. "My grandmother taught me," she replied softly. "She said a good biscuit could solve most of the world's problems." Calder considered this for a moment. A flicker of something, a shadow of a memory, perhaps crossed his features. Then, a small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a full smile, but it was the ghost of one, and it transformed his stern, weathered face. "She might have been right," he said, and in that small, shared moment of memory and flavor, a new foundation was laid. Later that morning, they were in the barn, and Calder was trying to coax a nervous filly into accepting a halter. The little horse was all long legs and wide, frightened eyes, dancing away every time he got close. He moved with his usual slow patience, murmuring to her in a low, calming tone. "Easy now. Willow, just a rope. Nothing to fear." The filly, however, was having none of it. She sidestepped, tossed her head, and let out a little snort. As Calder reached out, she suddenly shied sideways, bumping into a stack of empty barrels with a tremendous clatter. The noise spooked her even more, and she bolted to the far side of the corral. Her tail flagged in defiance. Calder stood there for a moment, covered in a light dusting of chaff from a nearby hay bale that had been jostled in the commotion. He looked at the filly, then at the fallen barrels, and then he let out a long, slow sigh of defeat. Clara, who had been watching from the barn door, couldn't help it. A small bubble of laughter escaped her. It was a clean, clear sound, rusty from disuse. Calder turned his head, and for a second, she was mortified, thinking she had offended him. But then she saw his shoulders shaking. A low, deep chuckle rumbled up from his chest, a sound so unexpected it was like hearing a mountain laugh. He looked at her, a genuine, unguarded smile finally breaking through his reserve, and the sight of it made her laugh again, this time more freely. They stood there for a moment, 2 solitary people sharing their first laugh in the dusty, sunlit barn. the sound of it chasing away the last of the winter shadows. The filly, seeing that the danger had passed, trotted back over, nudging Calder's arm as if to ask what was so funny. The moment was fleeting, but it left an indelible mark. A home wasn't just a roof and four walls. It was a place where you could laugh. That afternoon, Calder gestured toward a small, unused room at the back of the cabin. It was little more than a storage space, filled with old tools and forgotten furniture draped in dusty canvas. "You could take this room," he said. "Be more private." And so, another project began. They cleared the room together, hauling out old crates and broken equipment. A proper bed frame was found in the barn, and Calder repaired its broken slat. Clara scrubbed the floorboards until the pine scent filled the small space and washed the single window until it shone. It was no longer a storeroom. It was a bedroom. It was hers. She took the simple muslin curtains she had sewn for herself and decided they weren't enough. With a few coins from the wages Calder insisted on paying her, she bought colored thread in town, a deep blue like the evening sky, and a soft green like new spring leaves. She spent her evenings by the fire, her needle flying, embroidering a simple, winding vine of forget-me-nots along the edges of the curtains. She was reclaiming the flower from her past, turning the symbol of a broken promise into a mark of her new home. While she sewed, Calder worked on a project of his own. He took a piece of seasoned oak and, with his knife and a small drill, carved a row of sturdy pegs. He sanded them until they were smooth to the touch and mounted them on the wall in her new room. "For your things," he said, his explanation as simple and practical as the object itself. A hook for her coat, a hook for her dress, a place to hang her life. A home was being built, not with grand gestures, but in these small, quiet acts of creation and care. Word of what had happened in Calder's yard traveled through Dry Hollow with the speed of a grass fire. The story of how the quiet rancher had stood up to the wealthy, arrogant man from Wyoming and his marshal became the town's newest legend. The narrative shifted. Clara was no longer just the mysterious woman working at the Black Spur. She was the woman Calder Brooks had stood for. This conferred upon her a new status, a protective mantle of community acceptance. When she went to the general store, the whispers that followed her were different. They were no longer laced with suspicion, but with a grudging respect, and even a hint of admiration. Martha Gable, the blacksmith's wife, stopped her on the porch of the store one afternoon. "I heard you're a fine seamstress," she said, her eyes kind. "My youngest has torn his Sunday shirt clean through, and I'm all thumbs with a needle. I'd be willing to pay you to fix it." It was more than a request for mending. It was an offering of inclusion. Clara accepted, and soon other women followed. A dress that needed letting out, a quilt that needed patching. Her small corner of the cabin became a place of quiet industry. The coins she earned were her own, a tangible symbol of her independence. People in town began to change how they spoke of her. It was no longer that woman staying out at the Brooks place. Now, when giving directions or sharing news, they would say, "You know Clara, the one who lives at the Black Spur Ranch. Asterisk lives at..." The words were a quiet revolution. She wasn't a guest. She wasn't a hired hand who might leave when the season turned. She wasn't hiding. She was living. She had a place. She had a name. And for the first time, she had a home, built not on a contract or a promise, but on the sturdy foundation of two quiet people building a life. One stitch, one nail, and one shared smile at a time. The Dry Hollow Spring Social was less a grand affair and more a stubborn celebration of survival. It marked the end of the long, isolating winter and the beginning of the planting season. It was a time for the scattered ranchers and townspeople to come together, to mend social fences as well as real ones, and to remind themselves that they were, in fact, a community. The entire event took place in the street in front of the livery, which had been swept clean of mud and debris. Lanterns were strung from the porch of the general store to the blacksmith's shop, casting a warm, festive glow as twilight settled over the canyon. A fiddler and a man with a guitar sat on upended barrels, their lively tunes a magnet for the town's children, who chased each other in giddy circles. Clara hadn't intended to go. The idea of a crowd, of so many eyes on her, was still a daunting prospect. But Martha Gable had insisted, "Nonsense, child," she'd said, while picking up a mended apron from Clara. "You're one of us now. Besides, you can't spend your whole life hiding out at that ranch." And, she'd added with a sly wink, Calder Brooks hasn't shown his face at a social in 7 years. If you can drag that handsome hermit into the light, you'll be doing this whole town a service. To her profound surprise, when she'd hesitantly mentioned it to Calder, he had simply nodded. "I'll hitch the wagon," was all he said. So she went. She wore her best dress, a simple, dark blue cotton that she had painstakingly mended and pressed. She had even allowed herself a small vanity, braiding a piece of matching blue ribbon into her hair. As they rode into town in the wagon, sitting side by side on the hard wooden bench, a comfortable silence stretched between them. The air was soft and smelled of damp earth and new pine growth. For the first time, Clara felt as if she were riding toward a community, not away from one. When they arrived, their presence caused a quiet stir. The sight of Calder Brooks, standing tall and solemn in a clean shirt, was enough to turn heads. But the sight of him with Clara at his side was a confirmation of everything the town had been whispering about for months. He didn't leave her side. He bought her a cup of cider from a booth run by the church ladies and stood with her near the edge of the crowd, a quiet, protective presence. People were kind. Martha Gable drew her into a circle of women, asking her opinion on a new quilting pattern, Mr. Gable tipped his hat and asked Calder's opinion on the spring thaw. They were being woven into the fabric of the town, stitch by stitch. Yet, Clara remained on edge, her shoulders tense. She was still a woman with a past, a woman waiting for a storm to break. The threat of Jonas Kincaid was a quiet, humming nerve beneath the surface of her newfound peace. The fiddler struck up a waltz. The tune was sweet and lilting, a melody that spoke of hope and new beginnings. Couples began to drift into the cleared space in the street, the men bowing, the women curtsying, their laughter mixing with the music. Clara watched them, a familiar ache in her chest. She had always loved to dance, but it had always been a complicated affair. Her father was a short, round man, and dancing with him had been an exercise in careful navigation to avoid treading on his toes. The young men in Wyoming had been callow boys, their hands sweaty and their movements clumsy. Then there had been Jonas. He was a proficient dancer, but dancing with him was not a partnership. It was a performance of his ownership. His hand on her waist was a brand, his grip firm, leading her with a force that left no room for her own movement. He was taller than she was, but not by much, and he had a habit of leaning in, his face close to hers, his proprietary gaze making her feel trapped. She had always danced with her eyes lowered, focusing on her feet, counting the steps, waiting for it to be over. She was so lost in the memory that she didn't notice Calder had turned to her until he spoke. "Clara," he said, his voice a low rumble that was nearly lost beneath the music. She looked up at him. In the warm lantern light, the harsh lines of his face were softened. His gray eyes, usually so serious and watchful, held a new light, a quiet question. He held out his hand, a large, calloused, working man's hand. "Would you care to dance?" he asked, the formal words sounding strange and wonderful in his quiet voice. Clara's heart stopped. She stared at his outstretched hand as if it were a foreign object. Calder Brooks, the silent, solitary man who had built a fortress around his heart, was asking her to dance in front of the entire town. It was a public declaration more potent than any vow. It was an acknowledgement, an offering, a risk. Her own hand, when she placed it in his, was trembling slightly. His fingers closed around hers, his grip firm but not confining, It was a steady, reassuring warmth. He led her into the cleared space, into the center of the town's gaze. A hush fell over the crowd, the whispers dying down as every eye turned to watch them. He placed his other hand on the small of her back, his touch respectful and light, and then they began to move. For the first few steps, Clara was stiff with self-consciousness. She kept her eyes down, her mind focused on not making a mistake. But then, something shifted. For the first time in her life, she was dancing with a man whose height was a perfect match for her own. She didn't have to crane her neck or stoop her shoulders. When she looked up, her eyes met his, level and direct. And Calder was a surprisingly graceful dancer. He moved with the same quiet, deliberate confidence he brought to his work. His steps were sure. His lead was clear but gentle. He wasn't forcing her or showing her off. He was simply dancing asterisk with asterisk her. He created a space for her to move, to follow, to be a partner, not a possession. She looked up into his face, into his steady gray eyes, and the world outside of them seemed to melt away. There was only the music, the warm lantern light, and the man who was holding her as if she were something precious, yet not fragile. For the first time, she let someone else lead without feeling a trace of fear. She wasn't being controlled. She was being guided. She wasn't being claimed. She was being partnered. She relaxed into his hold, her steps matching his perfectly, her body following his lead as if they'd been dancing together their entire lives. The people of Dry Hollow watched, and what they saw was not just a dance. They saw the quiet rancher from the Black Spur, a man they thought had been lost to grief, moving with a gentle grace they had never witnessed. And they saw the runaway from Wyoming, the quiet seamstress who always kept her eyes downcast, holding her head high, a soft, genuine smile on her face. They saw two solitary, wounded people who, together, were creating something whole and beautiful in the middle of a dusty street. As the music swelled, Calder spun them in a slow, graceful circle. Clara leaned her head back slightly, a feeling of pure, unadulterated joy bubbling up inside her. It was a feeling she had thought was lost to her forever. She was not hiding. She was not afraid. She was dancing. When the final notes of the waltz faded into the soft night air, they slowed to a stop in the center of the street. They stood there for a moment, the spell of the music still lingering around them. The town was silent, watching. In the past, this focused attention would have sent Clara scurrying for the shadows, her head bowed, her face burning with shame. But tonight was different. She looked around at the faces in the crowd, the curious, the kind, the watchful. She saw Martha Gable smiling, her eyes shining. She saw Mr. Gable nodding his approval. She saw a community that had, against all odds, become her own. She then looked back up at Calder. He was already looking at her, his expression one she had never seen before. It was a look of profound tenderness, of quiet admiration. In his eyes, she saw her own worth reflected back at her. She was not a burden. She was not trouble. She was Clara. And for the first time in her entire life, as the whole world watched, Clara May Whitaker did not bow her head. She stood tall, met their gazes without flinching, and smiled. Summer had settled into the canyon like a warm, breathing thing. The days were long and filled with the steady rhythm of work, mending fences in the high pastures, clearing brush from the creek bed. The constant, patient labor of maintaining a life wrested from the wild. The Black Spur Ranch was no longer just Calder's solitary fortress. It had become their shared territory, a place of quiet understanding and burgeoning hope. The memory of Jonas Kincaid's visit had faded, not into nothingness, but into a scar that no longer ached with every touch. Word had drifted up from Cheyenne that he had left the territory, his pride wounded, his business interests calling him elsewhere. The immediate threat was gone, but Clara knew that a man like Jonas never truly forgot a slight. The fear remained, A low, distant rumble, like thunder from a storm that had passed over but might one day return. This evening, such a storm was gathering in the mountains to the west. The air had grown heavy and still, charged with the electric scent of ozone and rain-soaked dust. Heat lightning, silent and ethereal, flickered across the distant peaks, illuminating the dark, bruised underbellies of the clouds. It was a night suspended between the heat of the day and the coming relief of the rain. Inside the cabin, the world was shrunk to the warm, golden circle of light cast by a single kerosene lamp on the table. Clara sat in its glow, her head bent over her work. In her hands was not a torn shirt or a patch for a quilt, but the cream-colored cotton of her unfinished wedding dress. She had taken it out of her bag a month ago, not with the intention of finishing it for its original purpose, but as an act of reclamation. The dress had been a symbol of her bondage, of a life she was being forced into. The sight of it had once filled her with a sense of dread, but now she worked on it in the quiet evenings, her needle moving with a slow, deliberate purpose. She was not finishing a wedding dress, she was unmaking a shroud. With every stitch, she was turning an object of fear into a simple garment of her own making. She had unpicked the tight, formal collar, giving it a softer, more open neckline. She was embroidering not forget-me-nots, but the small, hardy wildflowers that grew in the canyon Indian paintbrush and bluebells in threads of vibrant color. She was transforming it into something that belonged to her, a testament to her survival. Calder came in from the barn, the scent of horse and damp earth clinging to him. He moved with a weary satisfaction. The day's work settled in his broad shoulders. He stopped at the wash basin by the door, pumping water and scrubbing his hands, the splashing sound a comforting intrusion into the quiet. He dried his hands on a rough linen towel, his movements economical and sure. His eyes fell on the dress spread across her lap. He had seen her working on it before, but had never asked about it. As always, he waited for her to offer the story, and if she did not, he did not pry. He simply accepted it as part of her, another piece of the quiet, resilient woman who now shared his home. Clara felt his gaze, but she didn't stop her work. A comfortable silence had long since replaced the awkward quiet of their early days. It was a silence filled with unspoken understanding, a shared language of presence. The thunder rumbled again, closer this time, a low, guttural vibration that seemed to shake the very floorboards. She paused, her needle held mid-air, and her gaze drifted from her sewing to the cabin door. It was a sturdy door, built by Calder's own hands, with a thick iron latch. It was a barrier against the storms, against the night, against the world. But she knew that some troubles couldn't be barred by a simple lock. The old fear, the ghost of the running girl, stirred within her. She had built a life here. She had found a home, a partnership, a quiet joy she had never thought possible. But it was all so new, so fragile. What if she wasn't strong enough? What if the past proved to have longer, stronger arms than the present? She looked out toward the dark, uncurtained window, which reflected the warm, intimate scene within. She saw herself, a woman sewing in a pool of light. She saw him, a tall, solid shadow standing just beyond the lamp's reach. This was her life now. But the question, the final, deepest insecurity, rose to her lips before she could stop it. She looked at the door again, the escape route she had chosen so many times before. Her voice was a murmur, almost lost beneath the sound of the rising wind outside. What if I still run one day? The question hung in the warm air between them. It was the last shard of her old self, the fearful, untrusting girl who believed that flight was the only answer. It was a test of this new, fragile foundation they had built. She was asking if his patience had a limit, if his quiet constancy was conditional. Calder didn't answer immediately. He walked over to the table, the floorboards creaking softly under his weight. He pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down, bringing himself into the circle of light. He folded his large, clean hands on the table and looked at her, his gray eyes as steady and calm as a deep, untroubled pool. There was no surprise in them, no anger, no disappointment. There was only a profound and unwavering understanding. He let the silence sit for a moment, letting her see that her fear did not frighten him. He had seen her at her most desperate, her most broken. This last tremor of doubt did not shake him. Then he gave her that small, quiet smile, the one that reached his eyes and made them soft. "Then I'll wait again." The words were a quiet vow, a promise not of pursuit, but of permanence. He was her harbor, the place she could always return to, no matter how far the storm might drive her. His love wasn't a cage to keep her in. It was a beacon to guide her home. A single tear, born not of sorrow, but of a vast, overwhelming relief, welled and slid down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She let it fall. It was a cleansing drop, a final release of the past. She didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. Words were inadequate for the gift he had just given her. Slowly, deliberately, she folded the cream-colored dress. She smoothed the embroidered wildflowers with her palm. It was no longer a wedding dress. It was just a dress. A story. Her story. She stood and walked to the small wooden chest that sat at the foot of her bed. She lifted the heavy lid, the scent of cedar rising to meet her. She placed the folded dress inside, alongside the spare blankets and the few keepsakes of her new life. She closed the lid. The soft, final asterisk thud asterisk was an ending and a beginning. Then she walked to the cabin door. The first drops of rain were beginning to patter against the roof, a gentle, promising sound. She took hold of the heavy iron lock, her hand steady and sure. With a decisive click that echoed in the quiet room, she slid the bolt into place. She was not locking the world out in fear. She was locking her life in, securing the warmth and safety she had found within these walls. She was no longer the runaway. She was home. She turned back to the table, to the man who sat waiting in the warm lamplight. The storm had finally broken outside, the rain falling in a steady, life-giving rhythm, washing the world clean. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please leave a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, *** Wild West Stories, 1850 ***, and give this video a like for extra support. Consider hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.